Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. From his humble beginnings to his time in Washington, this man was one of the most well-known and best-beloved statesmen in America, and he was one of the most prominent politicians in Maine history. And this man was born at Rumford, Maine. Stay with us and hear the true story of Maine's own Edmund Muskie, next on this all-new episode of Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine weekly podcast episode for August 9, 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. All new, weekly episodes of our Stories from Maine podcast stream each Saturday, exclusively on our YouTube channel. And our weekly articles, published in the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times Record, appear online and on newsstands each Friday. And you can follow Stories from Maine on our Facebook page, where we post new Maine history content each day. You can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
Now, let's head on over to Oscar for this week's feature biography of Maine's own Edmund Muskie.
Edmund Sixtus Muskie was born on March 28 of 1914 to Polish immigrant Stephen Marszewski and his New York-born wife Josephine Chernecka at Rumford, Maine. When Edmund's father came to the United States, he changed the family name to Muskie. Edmund was schooled locally, an avid sportsman and a baseball player. Edmund graduated from Rumford Stevens High School in 1932. Edmund then went on to enter Bates College, where he excelled in debate and student government, and he graduated at the top of his class in 1936. Muskie then attended Cornell University School of Law in Ithaca, New York, where he graduated with a law degree in 1939. Muskie was admitted to the Maine State Bar in 1940, before moving to Waterville to open his law practice and take part in local government. But in March of 1942, as World War II engulfed the nation, Muskie joined the United States Navy, and by September of that year, he was admitted to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, where he graduated as a midshipman. During World War II, Muskie served in numerous positions and was eventually assigned to the United States Naval Destroyer Escort, the USS Brackett, before serving in the Pacific Theater of War. When the war ended in 1945, Muskie was discharged from active service at the rank of lieutenant, and he soon after returned to his law practice in Waterville. By 1946, Edmund Muskie entered Maine state politics, when he ran for and successfully won election to the Maine House of Representatives. By 1948, Muskie was re-elected to the Maine House of Representatives, where he became the House Democratic Minority Leader. In that year, Edmund also married Jane Gray of Waterville. By April of 1954, Edmund Muskie declared himself a candidate for the office of the governorship of Maine. By the fall of that year, Muskie had won the election. For the first time in 20 years, a Democrat had won the seat, and Muskie became the 64th governor of the state of Maine and the first Roman Catholic in Maine history to ever serve as governor of the Pine Tree State. Immediately, Muskie got right down to work on issues of environmental conservation and reform and pressing economic concerns. Despite a strong partisan divide in the legislature, which was controlled by the opposing party. But in those years, the governorship of Maine was just a 2-year term, and time for Muskie to enact his reforms ran short. Before his first term expired, he expanded the length of the term of the Maine governorship to a 4-year term. Then, Muskie ran for re-election but his term was still limited to just 2 years. The new 4-year term would not be enacted until Muskie's successor would take office. By the fall of 1956, Muskie had been re-elected in a political contest that won him 14 of Maine's 16 counties. Muskie had much more he wanted to do as governor, and the voters gave him the opportunity to finish the job. In this second term, Muskie worked further to improve the environment, increase funding to public infrastructure, expand public works projects throughout the state, increase the state's minimum wage, endow many of Maine's public institutions and public services, and change Maine's general election from the month of September to the month of November. In his last year in office, in 1959, Edmund Muskie ran for the Democratic seat of Maine's United States Senator, and he became the first Maine Democrat to ever hold the seat by an election process. 3 days before Muskie's second term as Maine's governor had expired, and facing a time constraint, Muskie resigned his seat as governor of Maine in order to be sworn in as Maine's first elected Democratic senator, a position he would hold for the next 21 years. As Maine's United States Senator, Edmund Muskie spent his career working for the betterment of the environment, economic security, and improved international relations. Muskie became a public voice in opposition to the war in Vietnam, and he worked aggressively for passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1968, Edmund S. Muskie was a well-known figure throughout the United States, and he enjoyed a favorable national image. And in that year, the war in Vietnam and deteriorating race relations in America had both become contentious hot-button topics, and Muskie's position on these matters made him an attractive candidate for higher office. Meanwhile, President Lyndon Johnson's announcement not to run for re-election moved Muskie forward in American politics. Johnson's decision not to run for re-election allowed his own vice president, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, to announce his run for the American presidency. For Humphrey, his choice for a running mate was clear, and he chose Muskie to run for the second position to the highest office in America. But a rift in the Democratic Party was highlighted by public opposition to 8 years of Democratic policies, and the 1968 Democratic National Convention became the scene of protests and violence, both inside the convention center and outside. When the election results were tallied, Republican candidate Richard Nixon had won the White House, and Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew, not Muskie, was elected as America's newest vice president. The Humphrey-Muskie ticket had lost the election by a narrow margin, and Muskie soon after returned to the United States Senate. We'll be right back.
Our Stories from Maine weekly podcast episodes stream each Saturday on our YouTube channel. And our weekly articles, published in the Brunswick newspaper, The Times Record, appear online and on newsstands each Friday. And, each day, we post images and information on Maine's history on our Facebook page. So, please take a moment to like, share, comment, follow, and subscribe to Stories from Maine on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Stories from Maine. And, you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
Now, let's go back to Oscar for the rest of our feature story on Maine's own, Edmund Muskie.
By 1972, the nation's view of President Richard M. Nixon and the ongoing Vietnam War had both reached a major low point of approval in America, and Muskie, a staunch anti-war opponent and anti-Nixon senator, threw his hat once again into the ring. But this time, by announcing his candidacy for Democratic Party's nomination for the American presidency. Yet, the controversial dirty tactics of the Nixon campaign and his unethical White House staff had targeted Muskie for dirty tactic tricks and smear campaigning. False accusations were made against Muskie and against his wife, and a public condemnation of these smear tactics by Muskie only worsened matters, and his campaign for the Democratic nomination slowly withered away. Once again, Muskie returned to the United States Senate. By 1980, a 12-year Republican chokehold on the presidency was broken when a former Plains, Georgia governor and American peanut farmer named Jimmy Carter was elected as the 39th President of the United States. When Carter's first Secretary of State suddenly resigned his office, President Carter turned to Edmund Muskie to fill the vacant slot, as America's 58th U.S. Secretary of State, the first Maine man ever to hold the office of America's top diplomat. For the next year, Muskie dealt with tenuous international relations as the Cold War continued to pit the democratic United States against the communist Soviet Union. Muskie also dealt with the Iranian hostage crisis, a serious communist threat in Afghanistan, and tenuous relations in the Mideast peace process. But by the fall of 1980, despite Muskie's hard work and positive successes, the Carter presidency was seen by most Americans as a failed political endeavor, and Jimmy Carter lost re-election to Ronald Reagan in what became a historic Republican presidential landslide. When Edmund S. Muskie left the U.S. State Department in January of 1981, he ended a near 40-year career in American politics, and he retired from public office. But by 1987, Muskie returned to the forefront of American politics when he was appointed to serve on a special investigative committee known as the Tower Commission, which was charged with investigating the scandal-ridden Iran-Contra affair, which was consuming the Reagan presidency. Once the commission ended and reported their findings, Muskie once again returned to private life and continued his law career, leading a private and quiet existence at his home in Bethesda, Maryland. On March 26 of 1996, an 81-year-old Edmund S. Muskie died at the Georgetown University Medical Center in Washington, D.C., and he was buried at Arlington's National Cemetery in Virginia. For the entirety of his remarkable adult life, Edmund S. Muskie endeavored to serve the public good for both the state of Maine and for the United States, and his progressive work to improve the environment, advance conservation, increase economic stability, endow public institutions, increase public benefits, and establish and sustain world peace make him one of the greatest of America's political legends and one of the finest of our stories from Maine.
We hope you have enjoyed our feature story on Maine's own Edmund Muskie. Please come back next Saturday for another all-new, weekly episode of our Stories from Maine podcast. Thanks for joining us.
All Stories from Maine original content is copyright protected, with all rights reserved. Our Stories from Maine logos are trademark protected and may not be used without the express written permission of Stories from Maine author and historian, Lori Suzanne Dell. Thank you for listening. See you next week.